Hello and welcome. I'm Jenna Logue. The May 5th shootings of two gunmen by a police officer outside a Draw Mohammed contest in Garland, Texas, have intensified attention to the terrorist organization referred to most frequently as ISIS. A 20-year-old British computer hacker linked to the attack is an influential recruiter for ISIS. So what has all this to do with our guest? Well, Dr. Amy Kaufman, an associate professor in the MTSU Department of English, is director of conferences for the International Society for the Study of Medievalism. On April 16th, Dr. Kaufman presented a lecture at MTSU titled Dark Revival, ISIS Propaganda and the New Middle Ages. She posits that a good deal of the appeal ISIS has to disaffected and alienated youth is a romanticized concept of the Middle Ages, being acted out in the 21st century. And we're about to find out just what that means. So, Dr. Kaufman, it is great to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Before delving specifically into ISIS, could you define, as a scholar of literature, the differences between the way the Middle Ages actually were and the way that these young ISIS recruits fantasize their life could be or perceive the Middle Ages?
Absolutely. I think that there's a notion of what the Middle Ages is and what it's like that is not specifically Islamic or specifically Western, but that permeates popular culture and comes to us largely from 19th century romanticized notions of the Middle Ages. So we imagine a world, and it has both positive and negative qualities. We imagine a world, for instance, that is extremely oppressive of women, in which there is no free speech to criticize something like faith or a king or a monarch. Those are some of the negative aspects, in addition to things like torture, brutality, intolerance, crusades, invasion. And yet there's kind of a positive romanticized aspect of that Middle Ages too. One of the most influential and most consistent romanticized aspects is medieval masculinity. So if you look at a show like Game of Thrones, which is probably the most popular example of medievalism today, you see a gritty and barbaric and brutal world, but you see one in which men are extremely masculine, are capable of heroic acts. No one questions their power or their authority, and they are forced to prove themselves on an epic scale, which I think is one of the important factors here. It's very difficult to feel heroic and to define yourself as a heroic figure, excuse me, if you don't have a grand landscape on which to play out your heroism, if you don't have people you can cast as villains, if you don't have people you can cast as damsels in distress to rescue, and if you don't feel like the world is validating your power and your privilege.
When you say broad landscape, you don't mean just geographically, you mean societally as well.
I mean societally, yes, absolutely.
And this uber macho aspect to the propaganda fails to take into consideration the religious aspect of it all, or the way in which Islam is twisted and demented by the ideologist behind ISIS, but that's not really important to the young men who are being recruited, is it?
I wouldn't say it's unimportant. Religion is certainly a factor. And yet, what I would say is that the ability to use medievalism and propaganda in this way, and the pattern of using medievalism and propaganda in this way, is in no way unique to Islam. So in other words, any religious identity or political identity that has a nostalgia for a mythologized past can use this kind of propaganda and use it effectively.
Muslims would certainly say that Christians used that during the Crusades to great effect.
Well, and I've recently heard that a number of soldiers fighting in the Middle East are wearing Crusades patches.
I see.
In partly in response to this revival of the caliphate, but partly because it has the same heroic masculinist narrative, that kind of medieval hero fighting a, quote, just war. Well, I would say that Islam and religion are important to people who are going over. These are devout people. I would not say that this in any way represents the broader pattern of practicing Muslims in the world, not just in the West. That it is a religious motivation, but that is not what makes it medievalism. What they're drawing on is, in fact, a cultural pattern that crosses boundaries, across religions, across nations, into our popular entertainment.
And how does this fantasy proliferate in 21st century life? You mentioned video games. How else does it manifest itself?
We love it on television. Like I said, Game of Thrones, Vikings.
They said not just fictional TV, but non-fictional documentary TV too, right? Like the History Channel, I believe, was mentioned in one of your papers.
Yes, although the History Channel is doing a lot of fiction now.
Okay.
So the Viking show, for instance, is based loosely on a real saga from Icelandic literature, but that saga is itself a cross between fiction and history. So yeah, that show is most certainly fiction.
Right. And where does social media fit into all of this?
Social media is one of the most important factors in this, because the young people who are being recruited are incredibly isolated. And so more isolated than your average teenager in the United States or in Europe, which is still pretty isolated compared to, I think, maybe the way you or I grew up in a much more physical social community. So when you're a teenager, you find very much that people don't understand you. People in authority figures seem like they're often wrong. And so you turn to communities that validate you and support you and listen to you and tell you how misunderstood you are. And for some of us, that could be something like heavy metal music in the 1980s, right? Or the goth community or the punk community. But now, people's primary interactions are with their computers and their iPhones, their Facebook pages, their Twitter accounts. And that's where these communities are forming. And that's where the ISIS recruiters are preying on young people with various kinds of propaganda. This can be anything from medieval-seeming propaganda in Twitter feeds that show ISIS fighters posed as knights with scimitars riding on horses. It could be artwork. There are a number of pictures floating around online of a kind of hybrid ISIS fighter who looks like a cross between a samurai warrior and a medieval Christian crusader knight. And then there's personal messaging. Once you start looking at a page, you maybe contact a radical imam online, you maybe start posting to a discussion board, then recruiters will start contacting a young man or young woman personally. Particularly in the case of young women, they tend to message very romantically and very persuasively. And it's hard for me to remember as far back as being a teenager, but I think we all went through that experience of feeling like your friends were the only people that you could talk to, the only people who understood what it was you really wanted, and that's just what's happening here. It just happens to be virtual friends.
So youthful rebellion for someone between 18 and, say, 26 might manifest itself in the way that you dress, the way, what you do with your hair, what kind of music you like. It might even manifest itself in some risky behaviors like driving 100 miles an hour or, you know, engaging in drugs or whatever. But there's a far cry from that kind of youthful rebellion and the kind of youthful rebellion that results in human beings being beheaded.
Yes, although I would, there are two things to say in response to that. One is that many of the people going to join ISIS are going as computer programmers, as doctors, as brides, are going to support the community without expecting to engage in violence. I think that's something that we don't hear enough about.
No, we don't. But it makes sense that they would be a part of the caliphate if the caliphate is to exist.
Absolutely, right? That you would want to be part of a fledgling state in one way or another. And we all know through history and through current events that nations require war. And so that is not justification for this kind of violence in any way, but it does give you a little bit of insight into why people who are not violent specifically would be interested in going over and joining. But the other thing I would say is that we do have plenty of examples of teenage violence. Gang violence is a great parallel example. If you perceive yourself as being in a struggle for survival, then violence becomes a kind of necessary way of being.
Because all other systems in your way of thinking or to your way of thinking have failed you.
Failed you.
Education has failed you, government has failed you, family has failed you.
And rejected you to a certain extent as well. In the case of young Western Muslims, it's often social rejection at school. It can be abuse that you see happening to your family members or to your friends. And many of them are motivated by wars abroad and watching abuse happen to their own people or their family's people.
This ISIS hacker linked to the Garland, Texas attack is male, 20 years old, British, and from a working class family in Birmingham. He's the son of a cafeteria worker. Does that fit the profile of the young man ISIS is trying to attract?
Yes, although I should say that I'm not particularly an expert in who they are recruiting so much as how they are recruiting.
Yeah.
But yes, they are looking for young, professional, westernized people. There's a myth that young people are used as cannon fodder when they come from the West and they go over, but that really isn't the case because they often have economic resources, or they simply have passports that will allow them to travel. They often speak multiple languages, and they often have skills, invaluable skills like computer skills that ISIS really needs.
So they're not necessarily using the Westerners' militaristic skill sets, they're using their intellectual skill sets.
No, they have their own military skill sets.
They come equipped with military skill sets in addition to their intellectual?
Oh, I'm sorry, I meant that ISIS had its own,
no.
localized military.
I see. No, I was talking about the recruits.
Right, yeah, they often come with no military training at all. And they either have to be trained or they're simply not used as fighters.
And yet, with the religious dichotomy in play here, there was a professor named John Esposito who works at Georgetown University, and he said at an event that was sponsored by the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs that two of the most popular books read by ISIS recruits are Islam for Dummies and Quran for Dummies. So they're studying up on what they need to know in order to fit into this new society.
Absolutely, yeah. This is one of the ways in which religion is not the prime motivator for this kind of rebellion, and I think it really is rebellion, not just a bunch of murderous people lurking in the country, but a normal process for young adults that happens to have this radical form of expression that is just not available to many young adults. Although you do see, this is something I wanted to bring up before, you do see it in occasional people like young people who do school shootings and movie theaters. They've often been radicalized in their own way online, just not having anything to do with religion in particular. So remind me of where that question was going. I think I've gone off track.
That was about the Quran for Dummies and Islam for Dummies.
Yes. So the Quran, and actually any religious text, is a complex thing. This is one of the points that I bring up in my lecture and some of my writings, which is that any religious text is not a book that you can necessarily encounter one-on-one in translation, literally, and just get it. That's why there are so many people interpreting and arguing over interpretations, and that continues to happen even in radical fundamentalist communities, radical fundamentalist Islamic communities online, because the words are not immediately clear, and they're not meant to be, right? The words in religious texts are meant to lead us to deeper spiritual truths. So knowing what they need to know just to understand the religion fully would take years and years and years. You need to become a religious scholar in order to do that. So it doesn't surprise me that they're reading quick things that can allow them to assimilate and understand at least what their perceived foundling nation is doing. But then there's also a very practical reason for that too, which is that ISIS is carefully rooting out spies and infiltrators and enemies who are coming to the border to study them or to subvert them. And so one of the things that they'll do is quiz people on
So
the
if you
Quran.
slip in your knowledge of Islam, then you will come under suspicion.
Yes, and it does also have to be a very specific version, a very specific interpretation of Sunni Islam, of radical Sunni Islam, that if you are not a practicing Sunni, if you're Shiite in particular, you could be not only barred from entry, but probably killed.
Where do women fit into the fantasized picture of medievalism? Are they ladies fair to be saved by knights errant, or are they property, or where do they fit into the picture?
I think that the first is the most attractive version, but of course there's a radical split between women who are recruited to be brides, proper Islamic brides, and women who are used as sex slaves, concubines, raped multiple times and murdered.
It sounds kind of like a Madonna horror complex.
That's precisely what I was going to say. Yes, that's precisely it, right? The good, obedient, religious woman is valued as a bride and the mother of sons and children. And the errant woman, or the woman who practices the wrong religion, is punished very severely.
And how can it be explained that ISIS is recruiting women to ride herd over rape fests and police the dress and deportment of women? This is women terrorizing women. Where does that fit into the picture?
I think we all have a rosy idea that when someone is a member of an oppressed group, that they will always want to fight back. In many ways, it's easier to join. There is a semblance of power. If you are a woman and you're enforcing laws against other women, then that gives you an element of power that you wouldn't otherwise have if you were simply fighting the system. If it's encoded into moral or religious doctrine, that makes it even easier to do. Joining the oppressor is a way of surviving. It's also a way of elevating yourself. It's a very simple psychological answer, I think, even though it's a distasteful one.
It could either be the Stockholm Syndrome, or it could be a kind of a Machiavellian road up the path to power.
I think it's perhaps a little bit of both, but I don't think that ideology of women attacking women is exclusive to what's going on in ISIS.
No, I don't either.
I think you see it quite a bit throughout culture. So,
if you're a woman and you're married to an ISIS fighter and he becomes a martyr to the cause, does your stock go up?
Yes.
In the society?
Yes, your stock goes up in the society. You do. Theoretically, we don't have a lot of reports of what's actually happening to women on the ground there, other than the Yazidi women who were released from captivity, and their tales are all horrible stories of being held captive. There are a few women who have contacted their families through social media. I should say girls. They go over quite young, 12, 13, 14, to say that it wasn't all it was cracked up to be living over there, but their communications are very strongly policed. So a lot of what we know about what happens to women in ISIS is what ISIS wants us to know. So theoretically, yes, you are elevated if your husband is martyred. In practice, who knows?
There are some parallels that you drew in your April presentation between the fantasy and some things that hit a little bit closer to home for Americans, like the Ku Klux Klan, for example, who literally call themselves knights. And the fantasized concept of the American South is this beautiful place to live until the slaves got freed, and that just totally messed everything up. And we're fighting for states' rights, standing our ground, so forth and so on. Or the Nazis' demonization of Jews as vermin during World War II and Holocaust. What do these fantasies say about the role of and the power of fantasy in our lives?
Well, I think they speak to the power of a very specific kind of fantasy. The fantasy that there is a pure place in the past that was an orderly system where everything worked the way it was supposed to, in some cases ordained by God, where social boundaries were enforced rather than threatened. So I think It's an extremely conservative, nostalgic fantasy. And the Middle Ages plays an important role there because the Middle Ages plays an important role in the way that we define ourselves today. We either see it as backwards and we see ourselves as having made a ton of progress, right, and everything is so much better, or we see it as a purer, more heroic, more beautiful time.
Or if you reject it altogether, you see yourself as a Renaissance man, quote unquote.
Precisely, yes. And you define yourself against everything that supposedly happened in the Middle Ages, but debunking that would be a whole other show. I think.
It would take another hour.
It would take another hour. So the real appeal of those fantasies is the appeal of hierarchy, power, and order. In the and it tends to rise up when identities are threatened, particularly the identities of the people who have the most power in society. So there was a rise in medievalism in the 19th century, both in Europe and in the United States. In Europe because of problems with colonialism, of women agitating for rights, of slaves agitating for rights and being freed 100 years earlier in England than they were over here. And then in the late 19th century, the Civil War and the Emancipation Act, feminism again, women advocating for votes over here, and Reconstruction, where people in the South who had formerly been in a position of power if they were landowners, or if they were poorer white slaves, at least had some kind of superiority over someone and some kind of job security and social status. Saw that all ripped away in a moment, or seemed like a moment. It seemed like agony and eternity if you were on the other side. And so those are powerful moments for people looking to the past for the way that things were. The Southern slaveholders had already painted themselves as landed feudal knights, and it was only a few imaginative steps away to imagine themselves as crusading knights taking back the land. For Nazi Germany, you know, we sometimes see Hitler as coming from out of nowhere, but it was very, very slow, methodical process from 19th century nationalism to the 1930s Holocaust. It was a buildup of ideologies that recalled the Teutonic past, where Hitler made deliberate, not just Hitler personally, but the whole Third Reich, including its scholars, made deliberate connections between German medieval folklore and Old Norse, you know, where you had the really Aryan Viking style manly white man, in order to show that Germany needed to go back to its roots to purify itself. So in many ways, that's what's happening here with ISIS, is that they want to go back to the roots of the caliphate, not in the way that it actually was, because the medieval Islamic world was notoriously tolerant. Jews would leave Europe, Western Europe, where they were either thrown out by law or just subjected to incredible violence and discrimination, and they would go thrive in the Arab world and in Islamic culture, where they were second-class citizens, but they could rise to certain levels of power. They weren't in fear for their lives all the time. So what ISIS wants to go back to is not a real place.
No.
It's a kind of, I think the best thing I could say is that it's a, to them, utopian, to us, dystopian future that takes on aspects of medieval fantasy, but doesn't work in the way that the real medieval world worked.
And in the real medieval world, wasn't there more of a connection between religion and rational thought than there was between religion and extremism?
Yes, that's precisely right. Fundamentalism, which so for our purposes we can define as reading religious texts literally and acting on them literally, that's a movement that doesn't start until the 1900s. In Islam, in Judaism, or in Christianity. It is actually a modern movement. In the Middle Ages, religion and intellectual curiosity and questioning and debate and argument and query, all of these things were inextricable from each other. Faith could also be criticized. I was thinking about the shooting in Texas, about how I had a professor who said that he went to Boston College in the 1950s, and the Canterbury Tales was kept in a glass case, locked, and you had to get permission from two people to read it, because it was so critical of the Catholic Church. When Chaucer wrote, though, I'm not sure how familiar your viewers will be with high school Canterbury Tales. It's very, very condemning of various orders of the church. And when Chaucer wrote, that was just part of the conversation. People criticized the church all the time.
It wasn't as though he had written it during the Spanish Inquisition.
No, precisely, precisely. The Inquisition is another animal entirely. But in many ways, you know, there was more of an understanding of religion as something that was fluid, that should evolve, that should be reasoned out and questioned than there is today in a lot of circles.
It seems the concept, if I understand correctly, of freedom in the minds of those who adopt the fantasized view of the Middle Ages is different from our concept of freedom, especially in the young men's minds.
Yes.
Mature adults know that freedom and responsibility go hand in hand, but for these young men who are being recruited by ISIS, the definition of freedom is a sense of entitlement, a sense of domination, a sense of being able to do anything you want, whenever you want, regardless of the consequences.
Yes, it's power. It's the fantasy of power that we sell in our all of our medieval entertainment, right? The most successful person is the one who does the most killing and takes the most. ISIS uses Grand Theft Auto in its recruiting videos. It says you can play out a real-life Grand Theft Auto here. It uses Lord of the Rings, which is very perplexing to a lot of Tolkienites like myself. Actually, it's not that perplexing, right? It's a heroic struggle. People conquer things against all odds. They conquer their enemies, and they do it by taking, by acting out, by being violent.
But it's an interpretation of Tolkien that Tolkien never had in mind.
Tolkien would be rolling in his grave again. I think, in fact, a lot of us are rolling around still alive. But yeah, so what you are sold, we talked about what young women are sold because that's more puzzling. Why would you go over there? But what you are sold as a young man going over there is that you will be a powerful person. You will have women available to you as wives and as slaves and as concubines and as victims. And you will be socially elevated. The other thing that doesn't get a lot of coverage in the news that maybe should be even more disturbing if you're interested in dismantling ISIS is that they're setting up incredibly comprehensive social structures. Free education, they have a post office, they have roads, they will clothe you and feed you if you join. So you will be taken care of. You will not have to fend for yourself if you go.
These are the perks.
These are the perks. Yeah, I mean, there are the uglier perks, which I just mentioned, but there are much more realistic perks. Now, no one knows how long they're going to be able to sustain that kind of social welfare because right now they're getting money from selling oil because they've conquered many of the oil fields. But if they run out of money, then that will create some problems.
And black market oil is supposedly one way they're helping to finance their activities.
Absolutely, the biggest way. Yeah.
Since you're a professor of English and you're knowledgeable about literature, this raises questions about the fantasy itself. And this is not to condemn fantasy because it has inspired some of the most wonderful literature ever written. But the connection between a book and how it is misinterpreted by a young, impressionable, perhaps deeply disturbed mind is not exclusive to ISIS. You think of Catcher in the Rye being in the hands of the murderer of John Lennon, for example. There was an old episode of Dragnet years ago about a young man who misinterpreted Gustave Flaubert and went out and got into trouble because of it. Another young man who misread The Legend of St. Julian and took that as an excuse to kill for the sake of killing, just in order to feel what it felt like, to have the experience, to have all of the sensory input that comes with that. Can you talk a little bit about that and the role that fantasy has in feeding into, unintentionally, a young mind that goes out and does social ill?
Oh, there's so much to say there. Let me see if I can break it down into multiple parts. First of all, I think that when it comes to something like ISIS, mass propaganda that uses fantasy in a particular way, that's more politics than it is anything else. You can really use anything. It could be a text, it could be a television show, it could be a game.
Sure.
That is not inherently corrupting, but that can be used.
It's not the text, it's the interpretation.
It's the interpretation. And most of the way that we communicate with each other as a species is through narrative, is through stories. Most literature is fantasy, right? I mean, we have a genre that we call fantasy because it's got wizards and dragons and stuff in it, but almost all literature is fantasy, apart from maybe the realist movement of the last 200 years, which is its own kind of fantasy.
Right.
So I think, you know, people in politics, and ISIS is political, people in politics use narratives to persuade people because narratives are persuasive. That's why we have television commercials and advertisements. You can see a narrative in an image, right? It doesn't have to be a text or a story. When it comes to individuals using fantasies, I think on the one hand, you have the fact that young people do need narratives to define themselves. We all want to understand our place in the world and our purpose in the world, and stories help us to do that, right? They help us to make connections with characters when we sometimes can't make them with individual people, when we feel misunderstood. They help us understand why life is the way that it is, helps us process things like death and loss and love and heartbreak. A young person can obviously twist a narrative, right, and go in the wrong direction, but I would say that those cases are incredibly unique when compared to the huge numbers of people who find inspiration and understanding through literature. I think a pretty good parallel, actually, maybe this is controversial to say, is video games. A lot of people blame video games for allowing people to act out violence and for inciting violence, but a video game is just another kind of narrative. It's more immersive.
And you could spend another entire show talking about whether the video game is a release for one's frustrations or whether the video game inspires one to be frustrated and take it out on society.
You could, absolutely, but it's a mental fantasy that takes you through a story that millions and millions of people indulge in, myself included, without any negative consequences, right? Without going out and committing violence.
A TV show is a fantasy, a movie is a fantasy.
Absolutely, right. So violence is a problem that is often reflected in art and in entertainment, but is not always perpetuated by art or by entertainment.
In your April 16th lecture, you mentioned the U.S. attempt to win hearts and minds through social media to try to fight this with the theme of
think again, turn away.
Think again and turn away. As someone who admires good writing, you understand the power of words. Doesn't that sound awfully wimpy for an anti-terrorism message?
That's precisely the problem. And the people in charge of the campaign have freely admitted, the people who are trying to stop this recruiting have freely admitted that they don't understand why people are going over. And it makes sense that they wouldn't quite understand how to combat it. You need to combat it with a narrative of your own. Now that can also become dangerous. I mentioned the Soldiers Wearing Crusades patches, which was shared with me by a member of the audience after my talk last month, actually. There was also, I think, a news pundit calling for a new crusade against ISIS, right? That's another dangerous kind of narrative that, while maybe inspiring to some people, we don't necessarily want to indulge in. But I think
the same mistake President Bush made at the start of the Iraq War,
precisely.
was using it, the word crusade.
Crusade without really understanding what the crusades were, or the kind of damage that they did, the kind of violence. But I do think it's an important part of understanding young people and their motivations to understand that they do need to feel like they have a place, to understand that their life is going somewhere, that there's a purpose that is heroic. Maybe it's sort of Jungian of me to think that the human mind works this way, but we all want to be the heroes of our own stories, don't we?
Of course.
And just asking someone to move away from something without giving them something to move toward is not particularly effective.
Yes. as the young woman said to Marlon Brando in the movie The Wild One, where he was playing a motorcycle gangster, she said, "What are you rebelling against?" And he said, "What do you got?"
It's normal. I mean, it's part of the normal young adult development to want to break away from authority figures and find yourself. What's difficult is that thanks to the internet, there are huge communities that will give you a definition that's extremely dangerous to you and to all of the people around you.
Here's another take on words. In an invitation to an all-male fundraiser for a Florida congressman named Steve Southland, the event was described as, and I have to quote this, "good men sitting around discussing and solving political and social problems over fine food and drink dates back to the 12th century with King Arthur's Round Table." So we Westerners have no room to be smug and superior when it comes to fantasy. So these are our elected leaders who are purportedly helping to protect us from movements such as ISIS.
Absolutely, and if you go back through our history, there was actually, oh, I wish I could remember the name of it. It was a Bud Light commercial, I think, where they had maybe Burt Reynolds and a Manly Man round table. The ads ran for years, and it was specifically a no women allowed. We're going to talk around a round table and be real men like they were in King Arthur's day. I mean, that's the perception that we have of medieval masculinity, that it was a men's only club. There were no women around, which if you read Arthurian legend is absurd. If you read the medieval text, that's absurd to think. But that offers a kind of social privilege and validation that many men feel have been denied to them today, right? That special position in society they're now supposed to let everyone in. And so you have to get nostalgic and look backward to find a time where you felt more valuable.
So Mad Men becomes a great hit on AMC.
Precisely, yeah. Mad Men, Game of Thrones, Vikings, I keep mentioning those two shows, but they really trade in fantasies of power.
Why would Westerners be attracted to this fantasy when Middle Eastern culture is not their native culture for the most part, and Islam is not their native religion for the most part?
There aren't that many non-Muslim Westerners going over, although there are some. There are some who are converting to Islam and going over. A young woman in Texas, a few other young men, several Australian young people. If you are looking for definition, it doesn't necessarily have to be the faith that you were raised in, right? Part of a rebellion could be abandoning your parents' faith, right? Or abandoning your community's faith and finding something that feels more, I'm looking for the right word, more compelling, right? If there is a romantic struggle between good and evil, if you believe that there is, then that's going to be much more compelling than perhaps going with your family to church on Sunday and hearing the same thing that you've heard every day. So the other thing I would say is that ISIS also sells itself as very accepting of all races and converted people, as long as you convert to ISIS's particular brand of faith. Some of the Australians who went over, there was a story in The Guardian on one who died last month in the fighting, but he kept tweeting. He was a young Caucasian man. I'm not sure how he was raised, but he wasn't raised Muslim. He would continue to tweet about how there was no problem with racism over in ISIS, right? Everybody loved each other. Everybody was one under Islam. There was nothing but brotherhood. He would tweet pictures of himself with African and Middle Eastern men, and they all seem to be one community. So that's appealing too, right? You're not going to be marginalized because of who you are, as long as you convert.
I think it's fascinating to view the subject of ISIS through this romanticized Middle Ages version of a new life, a sense of adventure and everything. And I think for those who say, well, why are you trying to even understand what's going on? It behooves us to try to understand someone who is attempting to dismantle your way of life if you expect to protect it. It's not the same thing as rationalizing or justifying the activities that are taking place, but to attempt to dissect it is very much an instructive tool. And looking at it through literature, I think, is a very unique way and a very important way to try to wrap your brain around what's going on. Thank you. Dr. Amy Kaufman, greatly appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.